Hey, and welcome everybody to another edition of Email Never Sleeps. I'm Andrew Kordek, the VP of Customer Engagement here at iPost. And with me today, I've got a longtime colleague, person who's been in the industry for a really long time, Brian Westnedge of redsift.io. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience in the industry and a little bit about Redsift.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, great to be with you today. Spent almost the last 20 years in the deliverability space with Return Path for many years, then got into DMARC, worked at Proofpoint, Valmail, and now Redsift. So we're a email security company headquartered in the UK with offices in EMEA and Australia and the US, which is where I'm based out of, and spend a lot of time thinking about DMARC and BIMI, and then, per today's conversation is kind of why should a marketer care about those acronyms?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. That's the topic for today. Why should a marketer care about DMARC and BIMI, right? I think for more of the general audience, let's talk about DMARC and what it actually means for a brand in a nutshell. We probably know the acronym, but why should somebody implement DMARC? What does it do?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I totally acknowledge that a lot of marketers' eyes just glaze over when you start talking about SPF, DKIM, DMARC, and BIMI, right? These three-letter acronyms. So I think, let's say maybe mid to late 2000s, I guess, authentication in the form of SPF and DKIM kind of surfaced when marketers were thinking about kind of best practices, when deliverability really started to become top of mind for most folks, and authenticating your email was kind of one of the things that was suggested, in the long list of deliverability topics, like, send relevant email and keep your list clean and reduce complaints and all of that. And I think, hey, authenticate your mail with SPF and DKIM, that was part of it. So let's help ensure the delivery of legitimate mail by giving it the best chance by authenticating it. So definitely, I don't think of authentication necessarily as helping your deliverability perspective. It's not like if you have a crappy sending reputation, all of a sudden, if for some reason you hadn't authenticated your mail before, that it's going to give you some improvement, but at least it does kind of prove to the recipient of the message that you are who you say you are. If you still send crappy mail, you're going to have a bad sending reputation. It'll just be authenticated as you. So, you'll be tracked accordingly by Google and Yahoo and everybody else's reputation systems. But DMARC kind of came along because SPF and DKIM were kind of useful, and they were the baseline of authentication, but they actually authenticated values in the email header that no one ever sees unless they open a header, which most people never do. So what happened was companies would implement SPF and DKIM, and they would find, hey, why am I still being spoofed? And that's because kind of that visible from domain we see in our mail clients, SPF and DKIM don't authenticate that visible from domain. They authenticate these values in the header that most marketers, again, glaze over, like the DKIM domain and the envelope from domain. So DMARC came along out of an industry organization called MOG, which I know you're familiar with, and a lot of folks may be familiar with. And it just said, hey, we actually need to authenticate that visible from domain. So when somebody gets a message in their Yahoo client or the Comcast client or their Gmail client, they can trust it actually has been sent from that domain. And marketers adopted it again because, hey, this is a best practice. If I'm using somebody like iPost to send my mail, iPost, the reason I use someone like iPost is to authenticate my marketing traffic for me and to, as one of those lists of best practices. So it's pretty straightforward for a marketer to get DMARC implemented for their marketing subdomain. But then the larger discussion is, hey, if I'm a marketer, I don't look after like our corporate email domain that's used for Office 365 and Salesforce traffic and Freshdesk and Workday and all of these other cloud services. Like, what do I do about that? And BIMI now is kind of the carrot for the organization to implement DMARC. And we can talk a little bit about this, how a marketer kind of involves the rest of the organization, and how to make this more of a I guess a cross-functional project that marketing can get other people in the organization excited, and vice versa. Like if I'm in IT and security and I'm doing DMARC, I should probably bring marketing in so they can take advantage of BIMI as well.
Right. So, a lot of people, and I think DMARC was a little bit slow from an adoption rate. And there's been lots of studies put out about DMARC and implementing DMARC. And there's lots of information. I know Red Sift is kind of at the front and center of this and how you guys auto implement these sorts of technologies. But what's really interesting to me is that sometimes marketers take a checkbox approach, right? I've implemented DMARC and now I've set my switch to P equals none, but there's other switches, right? There's quarantine and there's reject and a lot of different things. And so kind of crossing over that chasm where I look at a lot of email headers. Yes, I'm one of the dorks that does that, right? I'm sure you do too, right? We look at it, it's authenticated with DMARC, but yet they're not necessarily utilizing it to its full potential. And I remember asking somebody about like, well, what happens if you just have DMARC set to P equals none for the entire thing? And someone used, and I'll quote, "It's a waste of time." And I'm curious, when we start looking at implementing, DMARC at any level, right? What your thoughts are about P equals none versus quarantine and reject, right? What are your thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. You always want to start at P equals none, because basically what that'll do is it'll start giving you the DMARC reports and visibility that you need to correct any authentication problems. So that would tell you, hey, I need to fix, my SPF for Salesforce, or hey, my SPF record is bloated because I've just added all these include statements over time to all these cloud services and I've never taken anything out, right? So you got to start at P equals none. That's the foundation. That's necessary. I think, from the other folks you've talked to, is a lot of people just stop right there. And that can be for a number of reasons. Number one is, okay, maybe I get the visibility and I can see that my marketing mail is authenticated correctly. So that's good enough for me as a marketer, because I don't control the rest of the organization. And no company I've ever worked with has like an email governance function. Email is totally siloed. So marketing looks after the traffic coming out of iPost, IT team and infrastructure team looks after the corporate mail from G Suite or Office 365. Nobody's looking after all those other cloud services that send mail. So it's really easy to kind of just do one little piece and then like, oh, I'm good. But the challenge is, from more of a security and compliance perspective, is if you always stay in a DMARC policy of none, you're not protected from impersonation attacks. And that means somebody can still spoof you. And I've seen it in my days of return path. People would spoof like a big retailer. Somebody gets a fake order confirmation. I get this crap all the time, fake Amazon orders, fake Apple iTunes orders, fake bank statements and credit card statements, all that crap. So you're, from a security perspective, you're no better off with a DMARC policy of none as you are with no record at all. So Microsoft, well, not Microsoft, that's a bad example. Google and Yahoo in particular are like, hey, we want domain owners to adopt DMARC, and we want them to adopt it kind of across their domain portfolio. So great if you implement DMARC on the subdomain you use for marketing mail, but we also want your organization to implement it kind of that top level domain. So if you want to leverage BIMI in particular, Yahoo and Google both require that both your any subdomain you use for mailing, as well as kind of that organizational domain, be a DMARC compliant. So that's a DMARC policy of quarantine and reject. That's where the marketer is going to have to get help from the rest of the organization, because again, marketing usually doesn't control those other mail streams. It's not their job necessarily to protect, they're not in security. Their job is not to protect the rest of the organization from attacks. But if they do want to implement BIMI, one of the prerequisites is, again, quarantine or reject on all domains, or I should say the top level domain, the subdomain. There's some other requirements. You have to have your logo trademarked. It has to be in a particular file format, et cetera. But I think the biggest challenge when we're working with folks is, if they're marketers, is, hey, get the rest of the organization involved. If you really want this reward for doing DMARC, which is BIMI, you got to get the rest of the org involved.
And so my advice to marketers, right, when they implement DMARC, right, is you have to be a good steward not just of your email marketing program, but email in general, right? You have to be looked at as that person that could help the organization. So you're right, working with other groups, right? Not to just be P equals none, and then perhaps maybe look at the reports every once in a while, but you're sort of protecting the organization, which essentially is like an umbrella, right? So think of DMARC as like an umbrella policy, right? Over from an insurance perspective, right? And then being able to make sure that you enforce that umbrella policy across, sort of everybody. And, it's interesting, you bring in BIMI, and I've done a lot of little research and understanding around BIMI. And I think, DMARC is really important. So if you haven't implemented it, I know Redshift's got a couple of products on that, certainly go check those guys out. But, I've read a lot of stuff about BIMI, and I got to say, I'm not a fan. And the reason why I'm not a fan of it, right, is it seems to me, and I know I'm going to get probably flack from this, somebody might say, seems to me like it's both an authentication play, but it's more of a vanity play, right? And I don't understand, and make me understand, Brian, help me out. What is the long-term implication, or has there been studies done? Because it's not easy to do, right? There is quite a few steps that has to go through from a BIMI implementation, right? And it's not just the email marketer. So help me understand from a marketer standpoint why I'd want to do this and what are the long-term implications.
Yeah, no, I think it's fair to say, like, I'm sure you're advising your clients to work on make data-driven decisions. And I think it's so early with BIMI today that there isn't a ton of data, like you mentioned. So Yahoo came out with a very preliminary study that said, BIMI leads to a 10% increase in engagement. We've done one case study with a client in the UK called TalkTalk, where they saw kind of a 4 to 6% increase in engagement. But frankly, I think there's a few reasons why there is not a lot of data yet. Number one is we still don't see a lot of people, you mentioned implementing DMARC is still a challenge. Well, the next step of implementing BIMI is, there's even less adoption. So we don't have kind of the body of work yet to derive some case studies. So that's why I'd love to work with marketers who are driving this, because the other side of this is a lot of folks that have implemented BIMI to date have been on the IT and security side. They got the DMARC project done. They're like, oh, this BIMI thing, I'm already at DMARC compliance, so it's a pretty straightforward next step to do BIMI. So they're the ones driving it, but they're not measuring the ROI from a marketing perspective. So we really need marketers to say, hey, I want this. And if they don't have DMARC yet, then they have to get IT and security involved and then do some case studies. So I think, my recommendation would be there is a crawl, walk, run approach to BIMI. So at Yahoo in particular, Yahoo, you can publish, kind of what's called a self-asserted BIMI record. So BIMI is a text record in DNS. You just say, here's my logo file I want displayed in a Yahoo avatar. And if your domain is at DMARC compliance, and Yahoo in particular says you have to have a good sending reputation and you have to send enough mail to our system that we can kind of measure that reputation, then we'll display your BIMI logo. So there's no cost per se other than the work involved. So that's kind of the first step that I could recommend to people is put your BIMI record in place. I think for Yahoo, you don't even need a trademark logo. You just need a logo that's in their file in this SVG file spec. So that's an easy way to start and see, hey, and measure at Yahoo. Am I seeing, however I measure email engagement and response and everything else today, am I seeing a lift from that? If you are, then kind of what's called a verified mark certificate is the next step. That's a certificate that's issued by certificate authorities like Entrust or DigiCert that basically says, hey, this entity sending this email from this domain has the rights to use this trademark logo and they've reached DMARC compliance and we've verified that they're legitimate. It stops somebody from saying like, hey, I'm Joe's Coffee Shop and I try to use the Starbucks logo or something like that. But I think part of the problem why we haven't had a lot of data yet is Google came out of their BIMI pilot last July. So it's less than a year in market and they rolled out BIMI in kind of general availability around the same time that Apple mailbox privacy protection came into play. So all of a sudden people saw opens and they're like, oh, is this related to BIMI or not? So I think back to your point is like, you know, I think there has not been the marketing push yet where marketing said, hey, this is cool. I want to do this. I want to stand out in the inbox, because not many people have adopted it yet. I think it's still somewhat rare. If you look in like your Gmail mobile client, and if you actually saw a logo appear there. So there's kind of a first mover advantage right now, because not a lot of people are doing it.
Right.
What I've seen, you would think that retailers would obviously be the first ones to adopt BIMI. I've actually seen adoption across a lot of verticals that I kind of expected, like travel and you know, technology and things like that. But I've also seen weird, well, unexpected verticals, you know, like manufacturing, Palantir, which is like a CIA funded startup. I've seen some nonprofits. I've seen some EDUs and government entities adopted. So it's funny, it's not just kind of in the traditional, you know, retail realms that we've seen. So you're back to your point about kind of the long-term implications. Again, BIMI wouldn't exist if Google and Yahoo and the other members of the working group said, hey, we want to see more DMARC adoption, and this carrot of BIMI is the way to increase more DMARC adoption. I think for the long term right now, from a BIMI perspective, is the working group wants to make it a little more inclusive. Like I mentioned, unless you're a government entity today, if you don't have a registered trademark, you can't get the verified mark certificate that will allow you the benefits at Google. So I think the working group kind of recognizes that that limits the opportunity, right? The certificates start about $1,000 a year. So your mom and pop small business, you know, that would be a fairly significant expenditure. So if we can expand kind of BIMI outside of, you know, traditional very large enterprise into other segments, then we'll just see more adoption across the board.
Well, we're almost out of time, but one of the things that I wanted to mention too, right? So if I'm a mid-tier, and let's say I'm an email marketing manager and I outsource my IT to other companies, and there's obviously projects and costs involved with that. That's something your organization helps with, right? I mean, that's something that they could go to you guys, right? And say, hey, help, right? We want to implement this. We see the value in it. Well, let's start at the DMARC side, then move over to BIMI. I mean, that's something that Redshift sort of specializes in, right?
Yeah, it's definitely, you know, our thought is the DMARC project is kind of, maybe not worthless is the term, but it's not as effective if you don't actually get to DMARC compliance, which is where we think everybody should be. So yeah, like you noted, a lot of people stay at P equals none, because DMARC can be a really tedious process, especially if you try to do it on your own. It is an open spec, so anybody can put a DMARC record in place. They get these reports that come in. They're these XML files. They're not really human readable. I think a lot of people give up after they see those reports. So you kind of need a service provider to make sense of it. Some people struggle with kind of that SPF 10 lookup limit or other issues with SPF. So we can actually host people's SPF, DKIM, and DMARC records so they're never kind of misformatted or exceed that 10 lookup limit. We have an integration actually with Entrust in our UI, where folks can just apply for a VMC from our console, and they don't have to figure out who do I go to at Entrust to work with us. They can just apply right from our console. So we want people to get DMARC compliant. We want them to do it quickly and with a minimum of effort, because it can be, you know, a tedious process.
Well, Brian, thanks for your time again today. Everybody, I know we got a little technical here. I think DMARC is very, very important. Listen to Brian. Go visit and learn some more about how I could value your brand. And I really appreciate y'all, you know, sticking with us, and email never sleeps. And Brian, again, thank you for your time today. I 100% appreciate it. And your mind and your thought leadership in this industry really is amazing. So thank you very much for contributing to Email Never Sleeps.
Hey, Ben, appreciate it. So glad to be here.